Hola, and welcome to the Overly Animated podcast, where we take animation seriously. We talk everything animation here, including BoJack Horseman, which we'll be getting into right now. I'm your host, Alex Bonilla, and today I'm joined by Michelle Anderer.
Hello.
Sam Quattro.
Hi.
And April Collins.
Hey, everyone.
Today we will be discussing the first 3 episodes of BoJack Horseman Season 5. You can find our previous discussion on the whole Season 5 of BoJack Horseman. We had an initial reaction podcast to that. You can find that at overlyanimated.com. You can also subscribe to our BoJack Horseman feed and iTunes at overlyanimated.com/iTunes. And you can also find us on YouTube as well on our Overly Animated channel. But when we talked about BoJack Horseman initially on this podcast, we talked about it with the season as a whole to discuss and the major things that stood out. So we're also going to do a series of podcasts focusing on smaller groups of episodes and seeing if we can pick out anything that maybe we didn't touch in the major podcast, or now that we've had a week or so to ruminate other things that may have come out, small details that maybe we didn't get to mention last time. But so we're going to begin with the first 3 episodes of the season, the light bulb scene, the dog days are over, and planned obsolescence. I guess we should still do like a non-spoiler beginning to this, just like our general reactions to these episodes without getting too deep into them, like just our general reactions. April, I don't know if you want to go first. Like, what are your feelings about these episodes, if there's one that stands out more, or how they compare to each other?
I think I'm gonna apologize in advance. So my first, because I've watched the season twice already, and my first watch through, I was sort of just kind of taking it all in, and then I can't remember which episode it is. I think it's The Dog Days Are Over with Diane and her episode,
right?
And that one,
Yep.
yeah, that one really stuck out to me for like out of the 3 of them, and I don't know if anyone knows this, but like Diane's my least favorite character, and so it was very interesting for me to have an entire episode that's dedicated specifically to her and like I guess what she's kind of going through. I'm not particularly sure if we're wanting to go into spoilers yet or not, but so that episode stood out the most to me, because of what she was going through. And I think part of it is because I can relate, because I've been through a divorce before too. And so I was just like, oh, this is very like interesting, like how you're kind of dealing with it. And also like the approach to the episode too, because it's very like, clickbaity, I guess, if that's the right word to use. Not only because she's going away, but because she's like sort of pressured to kind of write about it at the same instance, given her job at the time. And so I think like of those 3 episodes that kind of like stood out to me the most. And it's interesting because, you know, again, I've already seen the entire like season and I've watched it before. And that episode particularly stands out to me because of Diane and what she's kind of going through, and because I can relate to that or what she's going through at that time. And I'm like, girl, I feel you. Like, yes. So without giving too much away before we get deep into it. So, but that's the one that stood out to me the most of the 3 episodes.
All right. And we'll definitely be getting into that Diane's whole deal in that episode in particular deeper in the podcast. But Michelle, what are your general thoughts on these 3 episodes?
I think, and it's funny because when I watched the whole thing in like one day, they all started blurring together. But now that we're just focusing on 3 and went back and rewatched them, I feel a lot higher on the light bulb scene and Dog Days Are Over than I did initially. I think just like because I had hindsight and I wasn't just like, okay, what's going to happen this season? What does anything mean? Now it's just kind of like, okay, I know what the major themes are. What do each of these episodes individually have to offer me? And so there are more things I could really pick into and be like, oh, like this is a really good moment. Or like, oh, that's stronger than I thought it was. I still really don't like planned obsolescence. And we're going to talk about it. I feel like in general, I have not been that high on Todd this season, or maybe for the last like 2 seasons, honestly. I feel like this show isn't outside of him being asexual, I feel like he hasn't really been utilized in a way that feels like anything's changing substantially for him. And so it's hard to feel very invested in where his character goes, because it always feels like it's like, oh, B-plot goofy shenanigans. And I'd like to see him have more than that, because like kind of everyone outside of him is given something more than that this season. I think the first episode this season of this bunch is actually my fave, just because it's so tight and it has so much going on, but it all feels so consistently like it's so contained within the episode, and it's like introducing all these new characters, but we're going to spend the entire season with them. And I don't know, like it surprised me. I went back, it's like, oh, like you know, just objectively, this is like a very solid, you know, well-paced episode. I can see why it was the first one of the season.
All right. And Sam, do you have general thoughts on these 3 episodes here?
Oh, general thoughts. There's a lot of thoughts that we all have, don't we?
Heck yeah.
Okay, so the first episodes of the season typically don't really do it for me. It's like, yeah, we're just setting up like where we are in the timeline at this point, and like what's going on, who's doing what, etc., etc. So it serves its purpose for me for that. Second episode, Dog Days Are Over. I really liked it. Diane is actually my favorite character of the show. And I love her very much. There's a lot to go through with that, and we'll talk about it more once we get into the specific episode details. But when I watched it, I was like, fuck. Like this is some real shit. This is like, you know, some real experiential stuff. That like, you know, I can't say I've personally ever been to Vietnam. But like I've made similar journeys of that emotional caliber in my life. Episode 3, worst episode of the season. I don't.
Yes, thank you.
It's just such like, you know, it's sandwiched in between 2 amazing episodes.
Yeah,
and it just sucks. It is just like waka waka. Todd is asexual. Here's a big tub of lube
like, for everyone to fall around in. Yes, why?
It's a family recipe.
Look,
guys.
Hey guys, this was supposed to be a non-spoiler portion. You gave away that there was lube involved.
That wasn't the best part though, so I think it's okay. It's okay.
The lube is a spoiler. No.
The lube is not a spoiler.
Hashtag lube is a spoiler.
Okay, I personally did not say what the lube was for. It was just there.
Okay.
Within the episode.
There you go.
Lube discussion incoming if you survive that long. But just my quick general thoughts. The Dog Days Are Over is a great episode, and I think has a lot of deep themes to talk about for the various sides of society. The light bulb scene, I agree with Michelle that like when you watch the whole season, you kind of forget about the early episodes, so the light bulb scene kind of just washes away in your memory. But watching it alone, like it does feel like a better introduction to a season than previous seasons. Like comparing this to See Mr. Peanut Butter Run, for example, like the light bulb scene does a better job of hitting all the main characters, I think. And Planned Obsolescence, like it's slapsticky, so it just depends on what your mileage is with slapstick. For me, it wasn't that great, although we'll talk about some themes that are discussed in that episode as well. But now we will be discussing more specific stuff, so if you want to go watch those episodes again, maybe you don't have quite a strong memory of them, if you go back and watch them. I think our general consensus is that at least 2 out of 3 of these episodes are good. But so go watch it. And now we can talk specifics. I think the biggest thing out of these 3 episodes is probably the Diane episode. So I guess we can focus on Diane specifically. So in the last season, we left Diane and Mr. Peanut Butter, like their marriage breaking down, and at the end of the light bulb scene, we just get introduced like, hey, divorce papers. So like they just went through with it between season breaks.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Sam says good.
Right.
and with the Planned Obsolescence, we'll get into Mr. Peanut Butter. We don't really need to talk about him right now. But with Diane, the Dog Days Are Over. I think from the very beginning of that episode, it's very jarring and it touching in the way that like it just lingers on her crying in her car for like a good 30 seconds. Like it felt like a really long time the first time I watched that episode. Like
Yeah.
Agreed.
it hits hard to just open that way, like her doing her crying. But this episode is framed around 10 reasons to go to Vietnam, like a BuzzFeed listicle type thing, and the whole thing of it is like her trying to go find herself, and this episode is dealing with the idea of like what finding yourself really even means. Now, I guess we can talk about this first. The idea that Diane, in this show, she's. I'm trying to figure out the right word for this one.
Say it.
Say it.
Okay, look, Alison Brie voices Diane, right? Alison Brie is a white actress. We're dealing with her character, who is Vietnamese, going to Vietnam. So obviously, it's hard to remove that context from your mind when you're watching a show about a character going to their ancestral roots. How do you guys feel about how it executed this angle of it in terms of like trying to go back to your, trying to find your culture per se, dealing with the outer context of what the rest of the show is outside? I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll go first.
Okay.
Okay. So I thought that element worked really well, and in our Discord, Alex, I remember you brought up a little snippet of an interview saying that one of the writers, I forget who it was, I'm sorry, but
I can mention that there was an article before the season came out with Slate that Raphael Bob Waxberg gave on this episode in particular. And he did mention that what the main writer for this episode was Joanna Callow, who is Hispanic of mixed race. So that influenced a lot of the writing in this episode. And also they brought in a Vietnamese actress who had done work on the show before to give them extra context with dealing with the actual Vietnam stuff. I believe that was the portion that I linked in the Discord.
Yeah.
That's good.
And the impression I got from that was Joanna's feelings were very strong about this topic, and that's what I think makes it good. It comes from somewhere very real, where you're kind of trying to find yourself culturally in a space where God, I'm not equipped to talk about this. Where in a space where you're kind of melted into, like, we're American, we're Bostonian, we're this, we're that, we're like what Diane's dad says in the beginning, like, I don't want to talk about Vietnamese history on my day off, because he was like a Vietnamese history professor. And that sort of like loss of cultural identity that a lot of people go through once their families come to America. And I don't know, it's just, I thought that hit really well. Very hard to reconcile that point with Alison Brie voicing Diane. I mean, that's just like the big elephant in the room all the time, especially with this episode. Alison Brie is white, Diane is Vietnamese. Like, and Raphael can like do 50 million interviews of it, but like, it doesn't change that fact. And I think that's something that would make this episode miss for a lot of people, just on that simple fact. But I've been on the social medias and blah blah blah, and like I've been seeing a lot of people getting stuff out of this. And while for me personally, my experience with it isn't as one-to-one, I know that feel of like trying to escape your dumb bullshit life and trying to go like find yourself somewhere where you'll think you'll be more accepted, and it doesn't really pan out that way ever. So
Michelle and April, any thoughts on how the episode executed this part of the storyline?
Well, the whitewashing part, which part?
Well, like the cultural aspect of like trying to get into Vietnamese culture and it. Diane.
I think the one thing that I thought was really interesting about this episode was like this sort of perpetual feeling of displacement, right? That Diane is having. Because you have that flashback when she's talking to her dad when she's a teenager. She's like, Dad, like, I want to know about our culture. Like, why do I look different from everyone else? So clearly when she's growing up in Boston, like she definitely feels like an outsider, right? Like she grew up there, but like she doesn't feel like she blends in. And so this idea that she can go to Vietnam and like experience like the roots of her culture, but she doesn't speak the language and she's never been there before, and she puts on these clothes, but they feel like a costume. It's like, yeah, she's an outsider there too. So where can she fit that like feels like actual home? Like where is she not displaced? And I think that's a very interesting idea.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, I actually really, despite all of the whitewashing and everything like that, I think it's really interesting that within the episode, she's, she's sort of, again, Diane is not my most favorite character, but I like that she's kind of like owning the fact that she's like, I'm American here in like this foreign country. And then she's like, even at that point when she's sort of like owns up to it, she's just like, no, me American. And there's like that whole scene with like the American tourists and they're like, no, me American.
Yeah.
Yes. And so like, I almost like appreciated that scene just because of the fact that like Alison Brie is very much not Vietnamese, and the fact that she is supposed to portray this character, and that even in that moment where she's like, no, like I'm American, and they're like, no, me American, yes. And I'm like, oh my God, like the whole scene was a disaster, but at the same time I was just like I almost appreciate it specifically because Alison Brie is not a Vietnamese like of descent in any way, shape, or form, but she is also portraying Diane, who is supposed to be, and I was like this encapsulates like that whole like conversation almost, because again she's like, no, I'm American, I'm from Los Angeles, and they're like, no, me American, and I'm like, can you like it's a circle, and I'm like, can you guys like stop? But at the same time I'm like, okay, like I understand where this is coming from, so like I appreciated it in that sense, in terms of like the whole like whitewashing it, especially because like the fact that Alison Brie is not like Vietnamese and Diana's supposed to be, and like that's a hot topic with this show at this, in this moment of its life cycle, is that like, hey, like you have all of these like minorities, and then but at the same time they're voiced by white people, like what's going on? So.
Mm-hmm. And my personal reaction to it is because I'm also like in this situation of being a second generation person where my parents are not from the United States. I was raised in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
but like I don't look exactly like a white person. So like when I'm in the United States, there's you always get the feeling that you're not totally accepted by everyone, no matter what. But then also when I go to Guatemala, like I come off as an American. I have an accent I just can't get rid of. So so you end up feeling like, well, my parents are from here. I should feel more comfortable here now that I'm around people who look like me. But it doesn't work that way. But yet where I grew up, it doesn't feel that way either. So in the end, what am I supposed to? Why can't I find a place like that? So I definitely relate to that feeling in particular, and just the idea of that line that I think April mentions of like you put something on but it feels like a costume, and it just doesn't work, and you have to come to that realization at some point. But so at least in that aspect, I think that the episode works really well, and it comes off that whoever was in charge of writing this, it comes from a mixed race background, just because it does feel that it gives that off very well. And I think that, especially coming from the perspective of Diane being sounding American and acting for the most part just like any other American character on television, so it fits very much with her displacement in this society as well. And also that little scene that we mentioned about Diane and her dad not really wanting to explain much about her heritage, like especially that the little line where he says something like, well, Diane says something like, but people say I'm different, and Dad's like, don't let anybody tell you you're different, you belong. So it's like the parents want their kids to fit in no matter what, but sometimes when in pushing that narrative, they end up minimizing where they came from, and that ends up having an effect on the kids as well. So like I also appreciated that little detail since I've seen that happen in my family and in other families from childhood. So just these little details did stand out to me on second watch. Just like focusing more on those angles. So I appreciated those very much.
Yeah.
But
I agree.
I mean, I'd also say, like, maybe this episode's a long time coming because it's season 5, and before this episode, I can't think of a time Diane was really anything was drawn attention to the fact that she was Vietnamese American, like anything at all. And I think that's where some of the early criticism of her being Vietnamese American kind of came from, because like one, she's voiced by a white lady, and two, it's never really talked about ever. So it gives kind of this weird implication. It's like, oh yeah, we decided this identity for her for like the heck of it, without like really getting into like the repercussions of what that experience would be like for a character. And I think like that's still kind of a thing that should be talked about more. Like I do think this episode's a step in the right direction, but again, it's like season 5. Why haven't we gotten more Diane from this like, and this isn't all she is, but like, why has it been pushed away until now, basically? Why hasn't it been a bigger conversation? The way like other things really have, like we're going to talk later and future podcasts about like BoJack the Feminist, and like this show's so good about talking about certain topics really, really well, but this one seems like kind of a blind spot for them.
Maybe because they were too busy having Diane Mystery Peanut Butter bullshit.
Well,
like relationship stuff instead of identity stuff. I mean, I think that's a shame then, if that's the case, because I think Diane's more interesting than Mr. Peanut Butter.
Mm-hmm. And we will get into the relationship side of this episode, but just also another thing with this show is that it focuses so much on Los Angeles, which is depicted in this show as like the place where everybody can blend in and nobody really stands out because it's just a mishmash of everything. So, but that also, when you say it like that, it feels almost like hiding behind it, right? Like, okay, well, if everyone's together, then that means we never really need to talk about it because nobody cares. But at least this episode presents a situation for the first time where this becomes relevant and gives an opportunity to dig into it, and has important themes to dig out of it. So at least it is a step in the right direction. I'd agree there. But another part of Diane finding herself is also in terms of coming out of a relationship as well, because as is displayed later in this episode, they have their divorce. They're trying to stay friends, her and Mr. Peanut Butter. But then Diane sees Peanut Butter move on to Pickles, the dog.
No, Pickles.
Pickles.
Oh, sweet dog.
I don't like Pickles.
Yeah, I guess
Me
we
neither,
can do a quick discussion of Pickles here.
She's a sweet dog with a kind heart, and I'm not even a dog person, but like, I don't think there's anything wrong with Pickles. I think she's just trying to do
Let me rephrase that. I like she's fine as a character. I don't like her design because she's a pug, and the way her mouth moves when she talks.
Oh,
makes me feel weak.
Okay. No, that's totally fair.
Also, I feel like she has her tongue out a lot more than Mr. Peanut Butter does. So, like,
She's younger, that's why. She's more excited.
Pugs do.
It's on brand for pugs, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's the pug nature, I guess. But yeah, there's this whole sequence at the end where the Mr. Peanut Butter goes in to kiss Pickles, and Diane is witnessing all this. And Diane gives this amazing monologue of like, when he did it to you, it made you feel safe, and you realize he'll never do that to you again. It breaks your heart again. You thought your heart was so broken that you thought it could never get any more broken. So, like, it just and that delivery is done as she's like seeing herself crying all over the place, all over again. So now this episode, the other angle is Diane recovering from a relationship. Do we sympathize with Diane? I don't know what the question here is with, but like, how do we
like
feel
to see her cry?
It's interesting for me too. That's why this episode specifically is so interesting for me, because like as I've already mentioned, like Diane is my least favorite character, but at the same time, like in this episode, I can relate to her so much. And maybe it's because like I've been through a divorce before, so I can totally understand like where she's coming from. And it's interesting like the way that this episode is framed, but like that last like delivery, like I like almost shed a tear. I was just like, oh my God, like like I'm like, well, and that's the thing too, because like you never know how like the end of a relationship is going to affect you. And then especially because like Diane and Mr. Peanut Butter were together for so long, it seems. And they sort of like, I guess, go into that, like, especially in like later episodes and outside of, you know, the first 3 and everything. But like they had been together for a very long time. And so like, and you know, they go into the whole fact of like growing up together and everything like that. And so it's kind of like interesting because I sort of like went through that too. And so when she's just like, she's like, you know, like you think you're over it, but then like you see him doing these things and you're like, it's like you crumble into yourself. And like with my ex, like don't get me wrong, I never want to be with my ex ever again. And I'm so happy with like my current relationship and everything like that. But like when we first broke up or like, you know, separated and everything like that, and there was like a moment where he was like, oh yeah, like I'm with this new person, blah, 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 blah. And I was just like, ugh, like I wanted to die. And so like and you never like think that of yourself because you're like, I'm over this, like I'm done, like the relationship's over, like I'm a new person, which like goes back to like her like doing the haircut and she's dressing differently and everyone like points it out. And but then like there's like that moment where like it's not so much that they're trying to throw it in. Well, I believe my ex was trying to throw it in my face, but at the same time like Mr. Peanut Butter wasn't trying to throw it in her face, but she sort of caught it. And then it's like you want to die and you're like, ugh, can I not be alive anymore? And so I relate to that so much, like, and I like that this is sort of framed in like a BuzzFeed kind of article style because like when I was going through like my separation with my ex, like we didn't have these kind of like situations, and so I'm like, ugh, like why? Like it's sort of like it like brings up old feelings, and I'm like, I hate it, but at the same time I'm like, this is kind of wonderful at the same time. So that's just like my initial reaction to it, especially as someone who's like kind of been through Diane's situation before, because I'm like, I'm reliving it, but at the same time I'm like, I'm so much better because of this. Thank you, Diane and Mr. Peanut Butter. I appreciate you and your failing relationship.
Well, and the episode throws out that lifeline of hope at the end, because after this monologue, like Diane says, well, now you learn that you can survive being alone, right? Like that's a thing that I think a lot of us end up having to realize at some point.
Exactly.
And like, I don't think Mr. Peanut Butter, for the record, can survive alone. The first thing he said when they broke up was like, you know, like sometimes I do like miss you, like being in this giant house alone. I think Mr. Peanut Butter like legitimately needs some form of companionship. I don't think he can be alone. Yeah, he is like literally a dog. Retriever. He can't handle the independence of being alone.
Well, and it also ends up being a sign of maturity here, right? Like, Diane is able to grow from this experience, whereas Peanut Butter is not really. So, like, and I think that says a lot about her character, that in the process, like, this whole episode is framed around finding yourself, right? And I guess the episode is kind of saying, like, finding yourself isn't really something that happens in like one trip or is something that's tangible, but at the same time, in progressing to the point where she's come to this realization, it is kind of in a way like she successfully found herself, or at least she found a version of herself that is happier than when she left. I don't know how you guys feel about the episode in terms of like it's or explaining or fleshing out like what it means really to even find yourself when you go on these kinds of like emotional journeys.
I think it's just figuring out like your independence. You know what I mean? Like some people I know, and I could never imagine them like going to Vietnam by themselves. You know what I mean? Like, and it's funny because she frames it around like, oh, to reconnect with your ancestral roots. And I'm like, okay, girl, whatever you say. Like,
we know.
Yeah. But then it's great too because like at number 2, she's like, you can be a tourist here. And I'm like, that is exactly what you are right now. Like, stop kidding anybody. Like, you didn't go with your family. You didn't go with your parents. Like, you're here because you don't know who you are, like, as you're single. And then it's interesting too because what is it, like, point number 3 is like, you're single now. And I'm like, yes, you are single now. Like, I'm glad it took you until point number 3 to figure that out. Like,
true.
So I think that it's like it's sort of like what is it, like the 10 reasons to go to Vietnam, or like the 10 like ways to discover who you are outside of a relationship almost. So
I think that's a good point. And I think my perspective of Diane at the end of the episode was that she had come to terms with the fact that, like, she didn't discover any groundbreaking new information, but she did realize that she was getting to a different place, and that she was the one who put herself there, and that was kind of like enough for now, and that, you know, her finding herself is going to be kind of a lifelong process, but at least she feels like, okay, like, my apartment sucks, but it's mine, and I knew I was in a bad marriage. I'm out of it now, and yeah, it sucks to see my ex doing things with a new person that used to feel so personal and intimate to the two of us, regardless of the fact that I knew we had to break up. Like, that kind of hurts too. Which I think, like, you know, like, I can identify with that. I mean, but I don't know. I think the like Sam was saying, like, the independence thing is, like, huge, but it's also not the end of that journey, obviously. It's just, like, the first thing she can kind of point to and be like, oh, okay, no, I am in a different place now. And like, some of this isn't, like, super glamorous or great, but I feel okay with this. And I think the feeling okay is, like, super important, because she wasn't feeling okay in the marriage.
Yeah.
She knew something was wrong, and she didn't even know what was wrong. And I think she kind of got on her own case and decided, well, like, maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm just, like, awful. I need to not do this and do something else. So she did a really big change, and she went to a different country, and that didn't work. But she's slowly kind of figuring out, like, okay, like, that didn't work. The marriage didn't work. But, like, this thing I'm doing right now, like, this feels better. So I guess I'm tentatively on the right track somewhere. And that's what feels uplifting to me about it. It's not like she has a ton of answers, but she's just in a slightly better place than she was. And that feels like enough for now. And that, like, I like that.
Yeah, and the episode, it ends with Diane just being able to say calmly, like, I'm happy for you, Mr. Peanut Butter, and, like, that's how her heart cuts, right?
Like, she got to that place. Like, that takes a lot to get to that place.
yeah, it really does, though. I won't lie.
She, like, fast-tracked that, though.
You think, like, they went a bit too fast, Sam?
Okay, so my thing, like, fast tracking meaning, like, you know, she got over it very quickly, but I guess she was just doing other shit, which she was, obviously. I would have just been like, I'm happy for you, and then never actively saw Mr. Peanut Butter again. But then, you know, the rest of the season happens, and they keep fucking interacting, so.
yeah, but
not true to life there, but.
Well, confined to this episode, it feels uplifting. Like, if Diane wanted to never see Mr. Peanut Butter again after that moment, she'd be perfectly valid in doing so. I think that was a good moment to end on, just like her being able to speak calmly about what had hurt her previously after going through this entire journey. Now, in the middle of this, Diane also, we focus on 2 other relationships besides Mr. Peanut Butter in this episode. I guess we can talk about Diane and Bojack. That's a connection.
Oh my god.
comes up again and again in this episode. At first, Bojack just appears to help Diane move into the shitty apartment. I would like to mention that the apartment's name is Le Triste, which is just French for the sad apartment. So,
is it for real? That's
really?
amazing. I love that. Thank you, Alex.
Oh my gosh, there's nothing wrong with living in a shitty studio apartment. That's where I live.
You're
I feel
not
for you,
wrong.
Diane.
Diane, kind of, she's not, in love with it, but she also is like, no, I'd rather live here than in Bojack's nice house. It's her decision. Yeah.
No,
so
I totally
there's something
get
to be
that.
said for it.
It's so weird because whenever, me and my ex split up, I moved into the shittiest apartment I've ever lived in my life. And I was like, yeah, whatever. I'm out here making it on my own. Suck it, everybody. And everyone's like, do you want to move in with me? And I was like, no, I love my shitty apartment. Leave me alone.
Yeah. And
sorry. I can relate to that.
No, this does seem relatable.
Because she comes from a place where she's just like, no, this apartment's great. And I'm like, girl, you know that apartment sucks. Get out of here. Yeah,
that there's a hole in the wall. I believe at some point there's leaks coming from the
into
ceiling.
her coffee. That's so scary.
During this moving scene, also there's a line that will show up later in the season where Diane says to Bojack, "There's literally nothing you haven't told me." That comes back later in the season.
Yes, it does.
But later, once there's this scene where she has to work from home due to cockroaches and IT trying to unionize, and therefore
they
crew hired exterminators.
Oh my god, that is dark.
Yeah, they're exterminators. I mean, negotiators. Trying to hide it, but
it screams.
It's how the bourgeoisie lives, man. They just fucking squash unions, literally.
Wow.
Fumigate them
so
to
deep.
death.
I know, I'm so deep, guys. Anyway.
So she has to turn her work into a workcation, step 6 in her BuzzFeed article. And so she shows up to Bojack's apartment with a sad girl in a terrible apartment, which I think is actually like a okay line of displaying their friendship type thing, where Diane says it not totally seriously, but jokingly enough where you feel their rapport. I don't know. I just like the delivery of that line. Sort of thing.
I'm a sad girl with a dirty apartment.
Yes.
When you say it, it's so much more sexual.
I was like, Bojack, you can't make your friends say this. This is so messed up.
That's the take I got of him asking him for her to say that. I thought he was going to be like,
adjective girl anything. It's a little suspect.
Yeah.
So
I'm a sad girl with a dirty apartment.
Well,
please let me stay in your guest room.
House. Yeah.
Look, the fact that Diane didn't say it like that, I think, says wonders about their friendship. Okay?
Exactly.
Wrong, Alex.
But actually, going along that line, Diane and Bojack get drunk together later, and that Diane has to point out that they're both single at the same time for the first time in the course of the show.
Funny.
Diane, what are you doing?
But Bojack pushes back. He doesn't really lean into it, or do you think
he's scared? He is so scared.
That is the most proud I've ever been of Bojack ever.
Yeah, that he did not even for a minute go down, because he could have gone into it with her, oh yeah, it's so weird. What do you think that is? But he didn't. He pushed that away. He's like, this feels weird. We're not going to talk about this anymore. He just shut it down both times.
Mm-hmm. And I think that we'll get more into Bojack when we talk about the light bulb scene, but I think that this is a small sign in the opening of the season that Bojack was on a path to at least he's starting off better in this season than I think he started off in other seasons. So I think it's just a nice thing to add to his character in terms of his improvements based on comparing it to season 1 or season 2 sort of thing. But the Diane passes out, and she eventually goes back to work. And then at the very end, when Diane is flying back to the United States, Diane calls Bojack. It's I just need a friend, and Bojack is hearing her out. That's also a pretty somber conversation. There's not really jokes there, which is kind of rare for a Bojack conversation. But so that Diane Bojack, it's starting in a fine place in this episode. Obviously, later episodes we'll get into how it begins devolving, but I think that this episode shows how a Diane Bojack friendship could be helpful if they were both in the right place at the right time, mentally speaking.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, right? Because it seems like they have such a rapport, but I think it's because they're so similar in a lot of really bad self-destructive ways. Like that's a big part of why they kind of get along, which is sad. But I mean, why do you, I'm curious though, like, cause we're saying, yeah, like points for BoJack for not making things weird with Diane, but why do you guys think this is like the one time he's willing to do that? He's slept with like so many other people. Like he slept with the girl who was a child baby on his old show. Like, why won't he sleep with Diane? Like, why do you think he's not willing to risk his friendship with her? What's so special about it?
Because she knows too much about him. Like, I think that's also like it's something that they slightly address like later on in the season too. And I mean, kind of spoilers, but like he mentions later in the season that like he like of anyone he feels the closest to her. And so it's kind of like looking back, and I guess that's kind of what this podcast is like looking back at these first 3 episodes, like after watching the entire season, like he has so much respect for her that he is not going to like sleep with her or even like so much as to say like take advantage of her when she is most vulnerable, because not only is she like intoxicated, but she's also like, you know, coming out of this divorce, like she's extremely vulnerable from that. And she even like says so, which is like the craziest part, because she's just like, oh my God, we're both single. And it's like, whoa, girl, slow your roll. Like, I think that's like from that, like looking at it from the entire season, like he respects her so much that he is not going to do that to her. If that makes any kind of sense, which is extremely like crazy for BoJack, because like even, you know, like we'd mentioned, like even with like Sarah Lynn and like anyone else in this show, he's like been so quick to like, okay, cool, like let me lay with you kind of situation.
Let me lay with you. I love that. It's
You're
true.
welcome. But no, it is like, and that's the thing, like he respects Diane so much that even after she is coming out of a divorce with one of his least favorite people, like as we know of the world, and then she's also like drunk, he's still not going to have sex with her. Like that's kind of crazy, and it sounds terrible because it's BoJack, and
he was in love with her. He was in love with her before.
That's the other thing too. Like he was in love with her. Like, he even admits to it. Like, he's like, I'm in love with you. Like, before she even married Mr. Peanut Butter, he was just like, and he was, like, plotting ways to, like,
yeah, it was bad.
Yeah, it was super bad. And so it's so crazy to be like, wow, BoJack, look at you. Like, we're so proud of you in this moment. But, like, that's such a low bar to set for a human being. Well, a horse or whatever. But, like, for an animate object.
No, yeah, well, admittedly for BoJack, we have lowered standards, so because of that, this appears maybe more impressive than it should, but
exactly.
Like, I mean, it's something to point out, I guess, but...
No, I'm going to point it out to you, because it's like crazy, like how low the bar like is set for BoJack, and then we're going to sit here and be like, wow, we're so proud of you for not having sex with Diane whenever she was drunk. Like, good for you.
Right.
I mean, that does, like, make perfect sense, though, April. So, like, I guess to me, it's, like, a combination of he does actually respect her more than he is willing to be selfish, which was maybe the problem when it came to everyone else that he has slept with. Like, his own needs would trump theirs, and that's why he would always break up with people.
Yeah.
And the other thing, I guess, is, like you were saying, he's so close to her, what he would lose is so, like, the stakes are so much higher with Diane than probably anyone else at this point. And to the potential to jeopardize that is also, like, too scary for him to throw it all away over her saying suggestive things.
Like, it's actually super selfish if you think about it. Like,
in a way, yeah.
I'm sorry to derail this, but it's really like selfish of him. Like we're gonna sit here and be like, how nice of him, like, to not take advantage of a girl. But at the same time, it's like, no, your motivations were completely like solely like self-motivated at the same time, because he's like like, but also because she knows like so much like dirty shit about him, and it's not like even outside of the book, because she, you know, she was the person who wrote the book about him and everything like that, and she sort of like aired out his dirty laundry, but she didn't air out all of his dirty laundry.
She didn't know all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll be getting back to that later in this season once she figures out more dirty laundry. But but BoJack and Diane have a strong piece in this episode. Also, just quickly touching, we also had Diane having a relationship with a person claiming to be a grip, ends up being a best boy. It starts as the grip assuming that she's Vietnamese native and just talking to her as if she doesn't understand English. Diane goes along with it, and they have this whirlwind romance for like 3 minutes before a stage light falls and she begins speaking English again. She calls him out on just wanting some Saigon Girl cosplay, like not him being like, "Oh, there's a real connection between us," even though Diane hadn't spoken at all for the past 3 hours or so. I like the part of this where she says something along the lines like, it feels good to just relieve yourself of the burdens of who you are. Like pretending to be someone you're not, at least temporarily, does give you that kind of like it feels freeing to not be feel like someone doesn't know your history at all, and so because of that you can pretend to be maybe more flirty or more open than you usually would be because of your own imposed anxieties. That little line out of this scene stood out to me. I don't know if any other parts of this piece of the story stood out to you guys.
A little bit. Like it's kind of like one of those, like, she let her inhibitions like go kind of thing. I mean, they weren't to like the extreme as like other people's go to, but I think it's interesting though to like portray her in the fact that like she's in Vietnam and she's just pretending to be like natural Vietnamese kind of thing. So, and it's interesting too because they're kind of like, she's framing it in a like discover a new you, and I was like, are you really being a new you, or are you just being like a you who doesn't speak English kind of you? Like, you could have done that in LA, like. There's enough tourists there. Like, I'm just saying.
Yeah. Sam, did you have any thoughts on this piece of the episode?
I thought you brought up something good. That was, like, you know, if you go somewhere else, that you kind of aren't surrounded by, like, what's expected of you, or, like, how your friends know you, how your exes know you, etc., etc. You can just be a whole new person, except one that doesn't talk. You know, that's just how it is, I guess. Anyway, I think that's a great thing. That's sort of universal that I felt sometimes.
I'll just say one more thing about that, like, new identity thing, because, like, in my perspective, Diane wasn't even accurately portraying like whatever like a local in that situation would have done. She was portraying like her Americanized perception of what like the ideal woman, this bald eagle guy, was like. So she was like really quiet, and she's just like, oh yeah, let's hear more about you. Like, I don't think a lot of normal people would do that, but it's like she's playing into his fantasy more than anything organic, and I think that's like another interesting layer to the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Yeah, so I think we've covered most of everything about Diane.
Yeah. Oh my god, about one episode, that's true.
Yeah. Just some quick hits from like stuff that isn't really related to Diane in this episode. There's a joke that BoJack tells about that time when Old Navy told me they were looking for a fresher face and ended up with Sherman Helmsley.
Vietnam.
That was my Vietnam. Like
Sherman Helmsley actually like do things for Old Navy?
Probably not. He's been dead since 2012, but maybe he did Old Navy stuff in his later.
Let me look.
If you
did.
Look
he did.
Oh, okay, good.
In 1998.
Maybe he was still fresh in 1998. Yeah, but if you have a picture of Sherman Helmsley in your head when you hear that joke, it's much funnier. So I would just recommend Googling that. Let's see. The therapist shows up here. Her step 7 is your therapist tells you to go to Vietnam. And she is divulging personal information about Demi Moore and Bruce Willis and Angelina Jolie, and that is going to come up in sub. But I just found it funny on rewatch, like, oh, okay, so this is actually set up. Her just like letting other people know about her
later
stuff.
They have that whole entire episode. Yeah, no, that was pretty good.
Yeah. Diane frequently gets mentioned about her neck because she gets a haircut in this episode. So.
Hashtag long neck.
Yeah, so
I like Diane's haircut a lot.
Yeah, me too.
I like it too.
I love the shaped.
I also like it.
Yes,
I like the
Good
coloring.
Haircut. Is it coloring or is it shaved? I don't know.
I
don't know. It could be either.
I've been trying to figure this out for like the past however long that we've had footage of it.
I think it's shaved specifically because I want to shave my head also. And I'm like, damn it, Diane, you did it first.
It looks so good. You should do it anyway.
Everyone should do it.
Yes!
And Diane's new haircut shows up in the intro now, so that we've got that to watch every episode after this, so that's good. And there's like a Laura Linney subplot here where the movie they're filming in Vietnam is about finding yourself as well, but then it turns out it's just her finding her clone.
I think that's hilarious because it's almost like Diane's trying to like live. She's just like, but wait, what did Laura Linney like get out of this whole experience? And then it's like this crazy like subplot about like a clone and they fall in love and there's a steamy makeout scene and they're trying to like. It goes all the way to the top. And I just thought that was hilarious because I think that's like one of those things with like, especially with like those sort of like BuzzFeed articles, because people sort of read them to like, they're like, I need better understanding of my life. And I'm like, go out and live your life and you'll understand it.
Exactly.
Especially like in my workplace, because like all the time they're like trying to find meaning in things that like doesn't exist, where like my favorite thing is when people talk about how like this planet is in retrograde and I'm like, that literally means nothing to me and it literally means nothing upon your life, but they're like, that's why everything terrible is happening, and I'm like, no, it's because like the sales team sucks and operation sucks and all of these other things suck and they all happen to suck at the same time, and they're like, but it's because Mercury is in retrograde, and I'm like, no.
That's exactly why.
So I think it's kind of like funny because she's trying to find like meaning in something that means nothing, and I love that so much.
Yeah, and her and her clone have a hot makeout scene because it's progressive.
Yep.
Sure.
Honestly, I can never fucking remember who Laura Linney is.
I don't know. I don't.
She was in the Truman Show. That's about all I know.
Oh.
She's also done other things, but that's my main takeaway from Laura Linney. She was in the Truman Show. I think she was Truman's wife.
Thank you, Sam.
Listeners, please comment your favorite Laura Linney roles.
Yeah, because nobody. I'm sorry, Laura Linney. I'm sure you're a very nice woman, and I'm sorry that I can't remember all of your work. You're like the Margot Martindale to me. I can actually remember more of Margot Martindale's roles, however.
Yeah. And finally, just a quick mention that the outro music for this episode is performed by Thao Nguyen, which is doing a Vietnamese version of the usual BoJack outro, so that's a nice ending bow to the episode. But yeah, so I guess that leaves us with a little bit of time to talk about the other episodes.
Just a bit.
In both the light bulb scene and planned obsolescence, we talk about Todd's asexuality. That was a plotline that was introduced last season, and that season ended with Todd and Yolanda getting together and being like, "Hey, let's try this out." And so the light bulb scene touches on it briefly with a scene at dinner between Yolanda and Todd and Emily and the firefighter person.
Firefighter Joe. I don't remember.
Was it Steve or was it Joe?
They switched between
here we go.
Steve and Joe, so
I think it was Joe.
This particular one was Steve.
No!
dang it!
They got us again!
But I really like this scene because of just how easily they explain asexuality without it feeling totally out of place, because it's delivered in the goofy Todd way of doing it. Like it can be aromantic or be aromantic, asexual or be asexual, and you can be BB or BA, but I'm AB. And so like it's when you see it written out, it's like, okay, that makes sense as like a solid explanation for what asexuality is. While at the same time, like it still works within the BoJack Horseman framework of like just being like a funnily delivered line. So I especially love that part in terms of depicting the asexuality of Todd and Yolanda. I don't know how you guys feel just about the general. We can include planned obsolescence in this as well because it's also touched upon, although maybe more framed in jokes. But how do we feel about this show and its handling of asexuality in these 2 episodes?
So thumbs up to the serious stuff.
Yes.
I thought that was nice. Thumbs down to the tub of lube, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. I think like they've done a good job thus far of portraying asexuality. As to whether or not it jives personally with me, can't speak upon it. Not my experience in this flaming rock we call the Earth. But yeah, I thought it was good and informative.
I was gonna say, I think that's great though. Like I guess to build off of like Sam, I think it's between the 2 episodes, I want to say like I almost appreciate the first episode more than I do like the
third one.
Well, yeah, the third one in terms of addressing asexuality, because I feel like the like planned obsolescence, is so like crazy that and I think that's part of my problem with it. Like I appreciate that the show is addressing like asexuality as like a topic and everything like that. Like, don't get me wrong, but I feel like this episode is just so like over the top, and it's just like it's almost obscene. Like, especially with like Yolanda's like family and how like her mom's like a porn star and her dad. I don't even remember what her dad does, but it's like. Very
he's like an academic, and he likes to write books about sexuality.
He writes like erotic novels that are
novels.
And then like her sister too. Like I was just like, this is so over the top that I feel like again, I'm not an asexual, so it's really hard for me. But again, like I try very hard to relate, and so I'm just like, I feel like. Even like as an asexual, I would be uncomfortable with this episode, especially when the mom like tries to like undresses herself in front of like Todd, and I'm like, no, this is not okay. Like in any way, shape, or form. Like it doesn't even matter. Like even if like it wasn't like trying to address the topic of asexuality, like I'm not okay with this. Like. So I think like I'll give the first episode that, but like the second episode, even like my husband who like watched the episode with me, like or watched these first 3 episodes with me, like the first episode he was like, okay, like I understand what like being asexual is like, and I thought that was great because I was just like, wow, like I'm like he's like I understand, I appreciate it, especially because he's been kind of like watching the show with me and everything like that. And so I was just like, hey, like good for you. Like, I'm proud of you. But then like when it came to this episode, he's like, April, this episode's like really like absurd. And I'm like, thank you. Yes, I agree with you. Like, if you can see that this is absurd, then I also agree that this is absurd. Like, specifically, like, I don't know, like it's too much almost. Like it's almost like exploiting the fact that asexuals don't like that's who they are kind of situation. So
yeah, and like nothing was accomplished. The only thing that happened is that
nothing got accomplished.
Todd broke up with Yolanda. Like, wow, that was some. Thank goodness.
I thought that brought up something interesting in that the only reason why they were together is because they were both asexual. When in reality, you want to have somebody you can actually jive with, and somebody you can actually be in a relationship with.
I mean, I think
I agree with that part.
that whole focus took like a backseat to all the shenanigans, though.
That's true.
If it had been more about their relationship, I feel like their relationship was like the framing around the shenanigans and not the other way around. I think if there had been more heart to heart, more just like, oh, let's see them react differently in a situation and have to confront the fact that they only have one thing in common. But instead, we spend like most of the time in her parents' house falling over each other in lube. And I'm just like, why are we spending time here? I want to check on everyone else because this feels like just killing time and treading water.
Dude, doesn't the mom also just like wear like 10 layers of clothes or something?
He does, but like, why do we even care?
Like, why are we doing this weird like fucking things?
Just to
like,
get
the
to
world?
the point, like that's the thing too, is like just like at the end of the episode, he's just like, wait, why did you tell your parents I went to college when I didn't? And she's just like, oh, to make you seem better. And he's like, what? Like I can appreciate Todd in that like those like last like 5 minutes or whatever, but I'm like, why did we have the previous like 20 minutes to get to this point? Like we could have accomplished that. Like I can respect Todd in that fact, but I'm like, why did we have this whole like debacle with like them being asexual and then like her family being like overly sexual? Like it just seemed so it was almost wasted, like, because I'm like, why, like, what was the point?
Right. And I think that's why it's important to highlight that ending scene of Planned Obsolescence, because I think that's where in that episode, like the scene where they break up, like that's the most meaningful part of that episode, really. And like I do like the cut where Yolanda shouts that she's asexual finally, and then it just cuts to one thorough but respectful dialogue later. It's like after all the hijinks, it's like, okay, well they'll just talk about it off screen, and it's like, oh hey,
and that's what they ended up doing.
Yeah, so but I also like the message that just because you're both asexual doesn't mean that you have to be automatically paired together, and like you need to have more stuff connecting you. And I also like that piece of episode 1 too, because that's also a small C-plot thing in the first episode where Yolanda's like, well, I can't really tell people about you because you don't have a job, and Todd is actually looking for a job. Like he's actually like trying to putting in his side of the relationship. But then in episode 3, it's like it's still not enough. Like Yolanda still feels the need to hide other things. So I like that little progression of Todd and Yolanda's relationship. But yeah, it's just the giant chunk that we remember is the sexcapades, and that just doesn't
plug it up with your penis. Like what?
Okay, the big toe being the penis of the foot is kind of a good joke.
Yes.
Is it? I don't think the big toe is I think that distinction probably, like, biologically will probably go to, like, the pinky toe. Because it's just, at least my pinky toe, it doesn't really have too much of a bone in it, and, like, I can't really move it that much, so...
Oh, look, here's a better thought. Why not just the thumb? Like, the thumb is much more...
Or, like, a finger,
yeah,
fist,
you have more dexterity with the thumb.
Which finger is the penis of the hand?
I feel like it's the thumb because it's more maneuverable.
I don't
feel
think
like,
so.
I feel like the middle finger or your index or your pointer finger.
I think the pointer finger should be.
Fingers.
Yeah.
But not the thumb.
I think either middle or ring.
Ooh, yeah.
I like to classify things as penises that I can't really move that well on their own.
But they can, well... Okay, we need to cut some things out.
No, we don't. This is a
look,
this. Perfect. I love this.
We talked about penises for about 20% of the time that this episode talked about penises, okay? So we're safe.
We're good.
So, yeah.
Speaking of penises, yeah.
Speaking of penises, Bojack is naked in an episode, I guess.
Oh, yeah, in the first one, he has to, like, strip naked because...
Which
Rami
I thought
Malek
was
is like
hilarious.
Rami Malek is like, it'll show like the character's soul if he's just screwing in a light bulb naked. Who does that?
Yeah, going back to the...
Watch out for the broken glass.
Oh my god.
I believe he also plopped his penis into yogurt later.
So I thought that whole thing was hilarious because aren't like horses supposed to have like huge penises? And he's just like walking around like, yeah, it's not like anything you haven't seen before. And I'm like, oh.
Well, which is why when Rami Malek is like, and it has to be erect, so we show respect. Bojack is like, what?
Because like it's like no, we want to see your old like flabby like out of shape body and really like feel your vulnerability, but you must have an erect penis on top of that, or just no deal.
I don't know how penises work. Are they usually like?
They're not usually.
I know
erect.
they're not usually erect. I'm not that dumb. But like, why would
questions?
Like, do you just randomly get erections and then you change your light bulb? Like, what's that about?
Well, maybe because the darkness is a metaphor for darkness, putting on the light arouses him because it's the opposite of darkness.
I don't like that.
Even the thought of darkness also arouses him, even if he's screwing in a new light bulb. Like, if I didn't do this, it'd be real dark right now. And he's like, oh boy.
I mean, that's what gets me going, guys.
This is very deep Filbert analysis.
We should have a Filbert spin-off podcast where we discuss it. First episode
there is a whole Filbert episode. I'm just saying.
Yeah. But this first episode focuses... I guess the overall arc that I picked out of it is that Bojack... He's doing this Filbert show, and he's realizing that this Filbert character is just him. And especially when he gets into that half-drunken talk with Princess Carolyn in the middle, where he's like, I don't want to be this guy anymore, but yet I'm playing him now in a show, so how is that helping me?
Well, and I think it's hilarious, too, because the entire set is his house. Like
he has
reason to be paranoid, man.
Yeah.
And then Princess Carolyn has to give him the speech of like, well, you're an actor. You can just put on the costume of Filbert at work, and then when you go home, be the Bojack that you want to be, and be a better person.
It's a good pep talk. I don't know if it'll work, but it's a very good pep talk from Princess Carolyn.
I think so too. I agree.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, in this episode, it's like showing, like, this is how you can get through it. But throughout the entire season, it feels like that's the through line of Bojack just not being able to separate himself from the character he's playing. Like, he in his mind, he wants to get better, theoretically, but he also sees himself as this Filbert-type character, and that just keeps amping up until, like, the very end of the season with, like, episode 11, where he absolutely has no lines between what is real and what is fake anymore. But, like, it's interesting that from the very beginning, they're setting that up with just, like, Bojack already feeling uncomfortable with how close his life currently is to what it's being portrayed on screen. And I just like that being set up very quickly in this season on rewatch. Also, Bojack and Gina. Gina is a new character in this season, played by Stephanie Beatrice,
which I loved.
Yeah, how do we feel about Gina's first episodes here? We have episode 1 where she's just introduced as the co-star and like Bojack's also rising Set's partner. But then in episode 3, we also have this side plot of her listening to musicals, and Bojack tries to push her to the spotlight. It doesn't work out. How do you feel about Gina in these episodes?
I liked her better in the first episode than I did the third episode, if that's fair. But I liked like Gina as a character, and I was even more excited whenever it was Stephanie who did the voice for her. But I think it's funny too because Bojack's like, he's trying to be like the gentleman of the relationship, and he's just like, well, I don't think Gina would be okay with like me drawing her nude or like that whole thing,
getting her in trouble.
Yes, like I was like bothered by it, and I was like, okay, Bojack, I appreciate your being like a gentleman at this moment, but like she doesn't give a fuck. Can you please just leave her alone? Like, stop putting this on her.
Not only does she not give a fuck, but it's like he doesn't understand that the industry works very different for him than it does for her.
Yeah,
and like she can't say things that he can say and get away with it and have it not affect her career. Despite like that he is like, you're right, he's coming from a good place, but he just like doesn't get that. Like if she ever said one of those criticisms, like that would be it for her. Mm-hmm. And it's just so different.
Well, and it's not even sure that it is good intentions, right? Because it's brought up at first with Bojack just being complaining, like, "Hey, are you with me that this character isn't written good?" And at the end, in the blow up with Rami Malek, like he finally blows up with, "This show sucks." So like it at least to me, it came off as like him using Gina's complaints as just like, okay, here's a reason that sounds smart for not liking this show. Like originally just like, this sucks, but like now he has something to spout. So at least to me, it didn't even feel like he was doing it with the intentions of helping Jean out necessarily, but like just to complain, as Rami Malek I think correctly interprets.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Like 100%.
It's dangerous for Gina either way, also.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's see here. Are there any major pieces of these? Peanut butter. I guess we haven't. We've touched on peanut butter. In episode 3 is where we get most of him. He's moved on to pickles. They have this first date, but not really a date because they want to take it slow, going to see the exploding International Space Station. Peanut butter, I think, from this episode is already being set up as just someone who isn't emotionally mature. I think we get that a bit deeper in later episodes, but I think this episode already begins to do a good job of just him not being needing work more so than we've gotten displayed in previous seasons. Or do you think that we've already had this set up in previous seasons?
I think it, like, looking back, especially after watching like the entirety of the season 5, I think that it really like hones in on the fact that Mr. Peanut Butter isn't that mature, especially in like one of the biggest scenes that sort of plays out for me is whenever he's picking her up from the airport, or picking Diane up from the airport, and like as she's getting out of the car, he's like, "Hey, like I want to talk." Again, I'm just like paraphrasing in my own head, but he's kind of like, "Oh, I want to talk to you about something," and she's like, "Yeah, what's going on?" And he says, "Oh, I'm seeing someone that's not you," and I'm like. Like it's like just him saying like it's not you, and I'm like, well, obviously,
yeah, no
like,
shit.
but like exactly, like it's almost one of those things, especially because like given what we know from like that episode, like prior from Diane's standpoint, especially because you know she's like, oh, it's whenever you see him like with another girl and so on and so forth. And they already like emphasize on that with like pickles and everything, and it's like what state of mind do you have to be in to like almost flirt with another girl in front of your ex? Like how old are we? Are we like 17? Are we 16? Like what age are we putting this at almost? And then they kind of bring it home again. Like it's a very interesting sort of setup as to the almost immaturity of Mr. Peanut Butter. And I feel bad because Mr. Peanut Butter is so like happy-go-lucky, and then I'm like, oh, that's because he's young and he doesn't understand the way of the world. Like,
but actually, he's super old.
Yeah, that's the thing. He's
50s,
mentally
probably.
young, but
yeah.
Oh, that's no fucking excuse.
No, it isn't. That's the
It's
thing.
no excuse.
Like we always like he's just as dysfunctional as everyone else, but because of his like personality, I feel like we give him a pass so many times and don't really scrutinize the underlying problem. But like, yeah, his immaturity is part of his own dysfunction. And I mean, that's a big thing that has to be solved for him to have a marriage that lasts.
No, I think. Go ahead.
Okay. I think that the previous seasons they kind of did frame Mr. Peanut Butter as like this happy-go-lucky guy, and like all of his ex-wives were just bitches who lost their fun. Like what Katrina's first introduction, she's like, oh, I'm not here for like blah blah blah. I'm here like so you can run for governor or whatever. And like Jessica Biel's whole thing, and like, and then he meets Diane at this coffee shop, and it's like, oh, love at first sight with this hip barista chick. Like, fuck that. Really, like, he is how old, and he's like still like dating.
He's at least BoJack's age.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. That's just like something I noticed. Like I think this season is definitely the turn of Mr. Peanut Butter into not such a happy-go-lucky guy, into this actual character that has flaws besides, oh, my wife isn't talking to me.
I mean, that's the thing.
bad.
That's the thing I don't like about it, is that Mr. Peanut Butter, everyone who marries him, it's always framed like it's their fault for stopping, like they're not fun all the time eventually. It's like, and that's like, when Mr. Peanut Butter and Diane were together, that was like kind of what it was after a while, especially last season. It was always about how Diane just like couldn't feel comfortable in the marriage and they were having all these problems, and why isn't she just like nice and enjoying things, and like what's her damage? But like this, like later in the season, we'll talk about, like it gives a lot of supporting evidence to suggest that Mr. Peanut Butter is actually kind of the bigger problem of all of his relationships all along. And that's both frustrating to have kind of acknowledged, but also very, very, like, it makes so much more sense.
And it's set up in at the end of this episode, because he mentions something like it's not usually me that gets bored with them.
Exactly.
So like he is putting the onus on the other side of the relationship there.
Well,
Yeah, and I'd say like boredom isn't accurate. I think frustration is probably what drove a lot of them away.
Oh, Mr. Peanut Butter.
And also in this episode, like there's that moment where they go into the French restaurant. They think it's a KFC. It's actually Kiki's French cuisine or something. But Peanut Butter says like, I still have feelings for Diane. But then like immediately after, when they go to the date, it's like, well, yeah, of course it's a bad time, but hey, I can't control when I meet someone special, right? So
Oh
it's
my
like,
god.
Totally, that's literally it.
yeah. So like even though you still have feelings for someone, but like you're not mentally in the place yet where you can like settle with that first before you enter into something else.
Yeah, and poor Pickles, like she, like even her, who's like young and silly, she's like, yo, I think we're moving too fast. Maybe we should calm down. Like she's saying this already.
What she says, what does she say? She says, a wise woman in the restaurant.
Yeah. And he's like, ooh, yeah, she sounds smart. She listens to this advice.
Is there usually wisdom to be found in the restroom?
You never know, man.
You never know.
Not in a public restroom, in a restaurant, I don't find.
But maybe French cuisine has different rules.
I don't know.
Maybe.
I'm not big into restrooms and interacting with people in them.
Yeah. So, yeah, and just loose jokes from here. Peanut Butter and Pickles. Apparently, Pickles is also into the very elaborate Hollywood jokes thing, so they just like keep exchanging stuff back and forth. The only one I have written down in full here is, am I Taylor Swift's grudge against Katy Perry? Because even though it doesn't make sense, I want to be held for a super long time.
Oh my
That
Yes.
was a good one.
Maybe they just like made Pickles' character just to insert more of those really dumb Hollywood references.
Like those young Hollywood references
Yeah.
that none of us really get. I mean, I
But
don't
Mr.
get
Peanut Butter does, which is just adds to the creep factor.
the creep factor.
Also, Diane hosts a podcast about the International Space Station. She's interviewing Laika, who is described as the first woman in space. So obviously, in our universe, she's a dog who was sent into space. So I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
Did she
in-
die
in-
in space?
That. Yes.
In real life, she died in space. Apparently, in this universe, she managed to survive.
I'm so happy.
That's
Poor
good.
space dog.
Yeah.
I'm looking it up.
But I really love that, like, what is it? She's doing an interview with her on the night that they're planning to blow up the International Space Station. But then, like, they just go into Diane's, like, previous marriage and everything. Like, I thought that was great. Like,
Well, it was so weird, this setup, because it's like it was always planned to explode, planned obsolescence, that's a thing, and that's the title of the episode. And Diane is like, yeah, like my marriage. It's like,
Oh my god.
okay.
as soon as she said that, I was like, yes, let's explore this. Like, let's go.
There's also a joke here where Peanut Butter wants to change away from the podcast, but it's like, hey, look, a new single by 21 Pilots. Ew,
And he
back
goes,
to the
change it
podcast.
now.
God, who hates 21 Pilots so much to put that?
I do.
Oh, Alex.
There you go.
I was gonna
Alex
say-
does.
My husband got a really good kick out of that joke.
Yeah, 21
All right.
Pilots is not good.
I'm gonna say if I were about 13-ish years old, I would be super into 21 Pilots. But
You're
I'm
not
not.
13.
Yeah,
I'm not. I
mean,
was 10 years ago, and I was into My Chemical Romance. So there you go.
There you go.
Yes.
as a society, we're too late for 21 Pilots, unfortunately.
R.I.P. Every single person I've met who likes 21 Pilots is a teenager.
That's fair.
And from episode 1, just some quick hits here. We open with Los Angeles by St. Vincent, which I think is a very good musical cue to open the season, just because like it is about Los Angeles, about the superficialness of it all. And so it's just a nice piece to open it. Also in the intro for episode 1, there's an obituary for Ralph Carney, who he died recently. He is the one who performs the saxophone in the BoJack intro. So I like that they.
Oh yeah,
give him
there is a
piece there.
saxophone.
Mm-hmm. And they keep that throughout the entire season, which I really like.
Oh.
Do they? I
didn't
only
notice
saw it for
that.
episode
I
1.
only saw it in the first episode.
I think I remember seeing it in like later episodes too, because I was just like, there was like a moment in like a later episode, and I was like, who the fuck died? And then I like looked it up. Sorry, guys.
Like
But
the saxophone is important.
Yeah, but because I love like that intro song, and then I was just like, who the fuck died? That like where like I was just like, what actors of like I googled it. I was like, what actors from BoJack died, and like nothing showed up. And then I eventually stumbled upon like the saxophonist, and I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense now. Got it. Like, go April.
Yeah. Also, we didn't mention this at all, but BoJack Hollyhock phone call, and that was cute,
It
I
was
guess.
sweet.
So
Yeah,
I
that
would
was
call
sweet.
my little sister, who is like 32-ish years younger than me, at midnight /4 in the morning or whatever. But I thought it was
wouldn't
nice
Yeah,
because
she-
I am the little sister who lives many hours away.
Yeah, she attends Wesleyan, so a good East Coast school to call in the middle of the night.
Also, why is she asleep when she's at like is she not like a freshman? She should be out partying. What's wrong with her?
It's 3 a.m. You wanted the
Oh
party that
yeah,
hard?
it's 3 a.m. She's a responsible student at Wesleyan.
Oh.
Good for her.
I
I
wasn't
mean,
partying
good
my
for
freshman
her, but also like what's
April
wrong?
is silently low-key judging still.
Yep.
I love you, Hollyhock, but
But get your party on.
yeah.
Also, in the first episode, Todd applies for a janitor job. He has a very impressive resume. We do a lot of callbacks to past Todd ventures. Also, he mentions that he directed a Star Wars movie, but was removed for creative differences. So,
Yep.
shots fired at Lord and Miller. The Flip McVicker ends the episode with, "This is going to be a sensational season of television," and I remember that
really
being.
was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a line in the BoJack Horseman trailer, and I think it ended up being a sensational season of television, so a nice meta to end that. But I think that mostly concludes everything. Any other final thoughts you guys have on the 3 episodes that we've talked about today? Sam, you want to go first?
I liked that the song that Gina was singing was about corn. Or was it corn or was it potatoes?
It was corn.
It was corn.
It was a very corny song. Yes.
I liked it. That's just how musicals are sometimes. They're just about random fucking shit. And they're actually really good. I support this musical revolution that we have going on with Gina. Anyway.
Okay, Sam likes musicals. Michelle?
Don't screw anything in on like naked on a chair. You could fall. Someone no, you could get drafty. Just like bundle up and protect yourself unless you feel really, really sexy that day. Only reason to do it.
I've cooked naked before. It's not very fun.
You're not afraid of like the grease splatter on your bare
Yeah, I
skin?
know. I had to deal with that last when I cooked naked. I know that now.
You had your goal and you did it, so that's something. But
Okay, so Michelle gives the suggestion to please screw in your light bulb sexily. April, your final thoughts?
If you're asexual, find out the entire history of your partner, because you don't want to have to potentially plug up a giant vat of $100,000 lube with your erect penis that is not going to be erect. And FYI, the big toe is not the penis of the foot. Sorry.
The big toe is not girthy enough, is it?
I guess
At least not compared to my big toe.
No.
depends on the person.
Who has a girthy big toe?
I don't know. Like some people have, like,
Use your whole
girthy
foot,
feet.
guys.
Yeah.
Maybe
I guess that's the thing.
that
We were talking about fingers, but really no finger is as girthy as the
No.
big toe, I guess.
But even your big toe is not enough. I mean, I don't have a penis, so I cannot say from
Oh
experience.
my god. You're telling me they didn't have a dildo lying around the sex house?
You're
to plug this
right!
up?
Oh my
Like
god,
that.
that's true. Oh my god.
Where
they
were the
had
glass
a million.
dildos?
Or the rubber ones, or
the
the
rubber
silicone ones, or any of them for that
They-
matter.
Their house pillars were
They had-
shaped like penises. They have to have
Thank
dildos.
you.
Yeah, they
Thank
had to
you.
have some sort of phallic thing to plug this hole up, but no, they just have to throw Todd under the bus.
Dang it. I feel so bad for Todd
Wow,
now.
that makes me hate this episode even more.
Yeah, recent-
But I also appreciate that they were like, I always love whenever like the show doesn't like try to like rip off or like infringe upon copyright like on other things. And so he's like, oh, you mean like okay Homa? And I was like, oh no. And then he like half sang the song, but he didn't sing it enough to where you wouldn't infringe upon those copyright laws. And I was like, thank you. I like that. So
For some reason, I thought that was going to go into a discussion about branded dildos, but
I mean, we can.
As far as I know, there hasn't been an actual branded dildo. There was a Twilight-themed one. It wasn't tied in, of course. I remember it distinctly because I still have a screenshot of it. You could put it in the freezer for that authentic feel.
wow.
Because vampires
That's
are
not gonna-
cold.
That's not gonna work easy. You'd have to really train yourself to accept it.
Yeah, that
frozen
would be
thing.
that would not be fun. That would be
Agreed.
very cold.
I don't think I would enjoy that.
And like once it started working, you'd be like, oh no, I'm de-thawing it. It has to go back in the freezer. So you'd actually never use it.
Yep.
Yeah, so thank you for listening to this discussion on dildo mechanics. If you'd like more information about this podcast, which usually doesn't talk about dildo mechanics, but maybe we will more in the future, depending on response to this podcast, you can find out our previous episodes at overlyanimated.com. You can also join us on Discord if you want to chat with us about animation, dildos, or any other BoJack Horseman related content at overlyanimated.com/Discord. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/overlyanimated. Thanks to all of our current patrons, especially our patron of the podcast, Andy. Thanks as always to our Patreon executive producers, John, Ryan, Steve, and Hugh. We will be talking more BoJack Horseman specifics in the future. I don't think there are dildos in future episodes, so maybe not that specifically. But we will have. Is there?
No, there's not.
Okay.
You sure?
Pretty
You can
sure.
bring up dildos
Like
at any
80% sure.
No, there's a 20% in there that says yes.
Well, stay
There's
tuned
a
to
tw-
find out.
There's a 20% that says April will just randomly bring it up. Huzzah.
Yeah. We'll talk BoJack the Feminist next time, and maybe that will happen. But until we come back for more BoJack episode recaps, thank you very much for listening this long, and we'll see you next time. Adios.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.